Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking time to join us today. My name is John Childers. I'm the Vice President here at Vertex Consulting, and I'd like to kick off today's webinar, The New Threats Require New Defenses, Use of AI and Machine Learning to Better Protect Your Network. And for today's subject, I'm proud to announce we have a special guest presenter from WatchGuard, Ben Oster. Ben is the Director of Product Management at WatchGuard with certifications in areas of marketing and information privacy. Ben is a proud Cavalier, graduating from the University of Virginia in 2011. Also with us today is Brittany Dufeli, Marketing Coordinator here at Vertex. Today, she and I will be monitoring the chat and the question box there for any questions that you may have. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ben. Thank you on behalf of Vertex and our attendees here for presenting today.
Awesome, thanks, John. I'm really excited to be here and share this content with everyone and talk about kind of what's going on, both from a endpoint and protection model, as well as from the exciting things that are happening at WatchGuard. I appreciate the little bit of history as well. We joke as Cavaliers that we are now the national champions in basketball 2 years in a row because there's no basketball season. So back to back.
Back to back.
Yep. Anyways, so thank you all for joining us. Again, I'm excited to be here. And like John said, I'm the Director of Product Management at WatchGuard. And my focus is really about users. WatchGuard has for many years been a very strong player in the network security space. And over the last couple years, we've really started to expand out because our opinion is that you have to be looking at a complete solution to really protect anyone, anywhere. And my role at WatchGuard is really to focus on the user, figure out how we can protect the user and more importantly, honestly, the data that they connect to. With that, and especially in these times where a lot of people are working remotely, we've seen continued rise in kind of endpoints being a huge target. And when we look at that, we really do see the endpoint as the preferred target. When we look at the way incidents are coming up and down, and now this data stops in 2016. Unfortunately, this was the graph we had, but these trends have continued, right? Server attacks are down, people and endpoints are up, and they've continued to be driven up as we've moved further and further from what is kind of that traditional network layer, the four walls, right? Going into an office, and even before a lot of the country, I'm in Washington, so I've been working from home for months now. But depending on where you are, even before we had stay-at-home orders or any of the craziness that's going on right now, we saw these continuing to rise as the workforce became more distributed. So from the endpoint, attackers can access assets, they can compromise and exfiltrate information, capture intelligence, steal credentials, and launch other attacks. We at WatchGuard, from our Panda labs and our WatchGuard labs, see more than 200,000 new malware samples on a daily basis. And between 2 and 8% of corporate PCs have some infection. That's a Gartner statistic, which I thought was really interesting. And then we have also kind of the sophistication of attacks is changing. It used to be that AV was enough, getting some basic protection on the endpoint was enough. But as these attacks have progressed through new attack models, new vectors, new advanced ransomware, fileless attacks, things that are in-memory attacks that you can't see with your traditional security tools, it's been harder and harder to protect your endpoints and your users from those threats and those attacks. One of the things that we really have seen here, and this is, I don't know if everyone has seen it, WatchGuard has a threat lab. We run a threat lab full time. That threat lab does an annual or quarterly, security report. It's a great report with tons and tons of information, but all of this information really shows how attacks are coming in, what we're seeing, how they're being targeted to small businesses, mid-market businesses, and enterprises that we do protect. But one of the things that's so interesting about the way attacks are playing out now is this kind of time to attack vector, right? If you're looking at this infection and infiltration and exfiltration flow, we see that an investment in security, as investment in security goes up, you have a decreased infection rate. But once that infection starts, you start to get into this infiltration curve, and then the data exfiltrates. What we see and what the market generally sees is that there's about 250-ish days time spent between an attack happening and the time to discover that attack. After that, it takes about 82 days on average, again, for most attacks to be contained. This is what we refer to, and a lot of people refer to as the detection gap. What you're really talking about is once an attack happens and once someone is able to get into a system, you have almost a full year before that threat is dealt with, whether it's discovered or contained, right? And depending on the type of threat, the type of the environment it's in, this can go up or down. But on average, we see, and the industry sees, almost a full year from the original infection through to remediation. That's a huge, huge problem because we have no idea a lot of the time what's happening during that time. And even if you do, when you go back and you do forensics and you do a postmortem on what happened and how it happened, depending on your retention settings and the way you retain data, you may not even be able to answer that question in full. What data was lost? When was it lost? How was it lost? And we see this detection gap increasing. Right, the percent of incidents in which time to compromise was more than 6 days or less, is continuing to go up. The percent of incidents in which the time to discover was 6 days or less is kind of gapping, right? As the years progress, we're seeing this go up and down, but the trend in all of these situations is up. And attackers are more efficient than ever than defenders in trying to get into your systems. So as we look at the increasing rate from 2006, we were looking at about 55% of incidents were able to, or compromises were able to be discovered in 6 days or less. And in 2015, it was up to 84%. As these continue to climb and trend northward, right, it's important that we start to think about how we can be more efficient in protection, because the threats are becoming ever more sophisticated, ever more complicated, and they are everywhere as we change the way we work. So at WatchGuard, and you'll notice on this slide deck that it says both Panda and WatchGuard on it. WatchGuard recently acquired a endpoint security company called Panda. They've been around for about as long as WatchGuard, about 30 years. They started as a traditional AV company, and they've moved their way all the way through to endpoint detection and response, as well as a bunch of other things that they do in their stack. But one of the things that was so exciting for us about Panda at WatchGuard was that they have what they call their adaptive defense platform. And this has two really main components: this threat hunting and investigation service and a 100% attestation or classification service. What they've done is really kind of redefine the way they look at threats on an endpoint, and are creating what I would consider kind of a low risk, zero risk model. I know most of us in the security space don't ever like saying zero, but there is something to be said for, if you know everything that's on a machine, you can bring that risk down to zero or almost zero. So when Panda put together their adaptive defense platform, they really were looking at how can we integrate hunting and forensics tools, visualizations, the actual adaptive defense solutions with machine learning, artificial intelligence and manual classifications, and then integrate with other tools. That was the whole point of this adaptive defense platform. And it really has redefined the way that you'll look at an endpoint, and you'll look at the protection model on that endpoint. So if we say it's redefined, we have to start with kind of what the current model was or is. Right? And the current model is based on isolated detection of known malicious processes. Right? That means that all suspicious activity has to be investigated on a case-by-case basis, and anything that is unknown is allowed to run until we can make a determination. This is kind of that traditional AV model, right? You have an endpoint or a point of access that has a bunch of processes and binaries and executables on it, and that has a whole slew of files and actions and processes and activities on your endpoint that are just unknown. We don't know what's happening there. We don't know what's going on. in those files, because if they're not executing, we're not paying attention to them. Once they execute, we can go, oh, you know what? No, this is bad. Stop that. Obviously, it's bad. We know it's bad. And this is a great way to detect against those known threats, things that are malware that we have already seen, or as an older threat, or as a mild evolution of that threat. We can look at, oh, you know what? This was something we saw last week. This is something we saw 2 years ago. It's a great way to deal with known threats, right? The current model does a great job of things we've already seen. And then it does an okay job of creating these kind of suspicious activities, right? If it's something that we haven't seen, but maybe it's behaving odd, right? We can take a look at that. And this is kind of the evolution from a traditional antivirus solution into what we call EDR, and what the industry has dubbed endpoint detection and response. And this is going to allow us to take a look at what's on the endpoint, what's being used and accessed, and what's executing on that endpoint, and say, you know, this is behaving a little weird, right? EDR is kind of the equivalent to those see something, say something posters on the New York subway, right? It creates this understanding of that might not be right. Maybe I should talk about it. The current model does a good job at kind of that traditional threat, but what it does is creates a ton of risk inside of these unknowns. There is risk on anything that we don't know about, because if we don't know about it, we can't protect you from it, right? And your solutions can't protect the end user from executing a bad file, or opening and running a bad script inside of an Excel workbook. If it's an unknown, we can't make a determination until we know what it is. And then we have a ton of effort that's created inside of these suspicious items. So anything that's suspicious really does need to be investigated by either you, or by Vertex, or by an actual analyst who can touch that suspicious activity and make a determination on it. And that creates a ton of work. And this is one of the reasons that endpoint detection and response has been so hard in the past to implement, because it's a labor-intensive process. You either have to pay somebody to do it for you, or hire people that can do it in-house. And this is it's complicated work. It's research heavy, and it can take a lot of time to solve these problems inside of your own environment. So with the adaptive defense approach, we're really looking at managed services using real-time visibility and forensic analysis. So based on the classification of all the running processes on your network and your endpoints, we generate a situation where we take these unknown files and we monitor every activity. Your endpoint solution monitors every activity that's running on that endpoint that your user is doing. All the behavior is verified by the managed service, so there's no additional steps that have to be taken. And this creates this kind of maximum level of protection with less effort and no risk, right? If we look at all of the unknown files on there and we say, you know what, the first thing we're going to do is look at absolutely everything on that endpoint. Instead of leaving out all these files that we don't know about and looking at these, the content or the executables or the binaries that are on the system, instead of just kind of saying, oh, when it runs, we'll take a look at it, we actually look at these ahead of time and we classify all of these as goodware or badware, right? So now that we don't have unknowns, we've created this zero risk. If we know it's good, there is no risk in it, right? So we can create these classifications of known goodware on your endpoint. Beyond that, obviously, we can look at malware, right? If something is known bad, we can go, hey, this is known bad, don't execute. That one's pretty straightforward. But what we've been able to do is take all those unknown threats and anything that might be malware inside of that. We've moved over to the malware category because we've classified everything on that endpoint and moved you away from this unknown model. And then we've also taken all of these suspicious activities, and because we can classify everything on that endpoint, we remove the suspicious activity, create these classifications, and now all you have on your endpoints and all you have that your users can interact with is goodware and badware. And I say that, right, you can interact with badware. The goal is obviously we're not going to let you interact with that malware, but we can classify these things as good and bad, and anything that's not good will be blocked. We also run this classification service as a managed service inside of the Adaptive Defense platform. So that doesn't mean that you have to grant access to your environment. That doesn't mean that you have to delegate to WatchGuard anything, right? The idea here is that, and we'll get into a day in the life of a piece of data a little bit later, but what that really means is that anything that needs to be classified that is an unknown is done by our threat research labs and through our machine learning and AI solutions in the cloud, so that you don't have to wait for a local analyst to take a look at it. We're processing all of this data through our machine learning engines, and then anything that needs a human touch, we'll get it through our threat labs. So it's a managed service. We call it the 100% attestation service. It really is that 100% classification. Now, Adaptive Defense 360, and I've talked about the Adaptive Defense platform, but Adaptive Defense 360 is really an endpoint cybersecurity solution that we roll out that automates prevention, detections, forensics, and remediation to provide tools for containment, response, and attack surface reduction on any present or future malware-based, fileless, or malware-less advanced threats. The idea here is that anything new, anything known, anything unknown, anything that is could be dangerous to you is always understood before it can execute. And we do believe that this differs from other automated EDR capabilities because of these two services. I talked about the 100% managed or attestation service, excuse me, and that 100% classification really does drive the differentiation inside of our EDR capabilities. And then the threat hunting and investigation service that's on the back end is really part of that. It is the backbone of this attestation service. So when we look at the differentiation here, we talk about prevention, detection, and response. There's a single lightweight agent, real-time and historical data is transferred to the cloud there, highly visible high visibility on all of your endpoint activity. We have a history of what's going on. We can look at the content that you've seen, the threats that you've seen, and all of this will pop right into your cloud UI. You can also look at it. We make all of that data available as well as any decisions. That 100% attestation service denies all unknown processes until we classify it either through our machine learning or with a human touch. This creates the maximum amount of prevention and protection on the endpoint. Excuse me. So when we look at using this attestation service on an endpoint, we won't allow something that we don't understand to execute to ensure that that machine is safe. The threat hunting and investigation service is led by Panda Security and the MSSP threat hunters in their threat labs. We also receive information from people like Verus when it's helpful, or people like Vertex, excuse me, when it's helpful. Those MSSPs that are out there in the world send, hey, we saw this threat, you need to know about it. And we'll integrate those things directly into our intelligence to protect not only their customers and you, but everyone else that might encounter it. And these actual threat hunters do discover new malwareless threats and techniques that all feed back into our threat hunting and investigation service and that attestation service. And then no endpoint detection and response solution would be complete without the response action. And so containment, response, and attack surface reduction is critical to this. So we can automate the containment and remediation and then the forensic analysis on anything that happened in your environment so we can reduce that attack surface. So again, I've talked about that 100% attestation service, that 100% classification. The idea here is that malware is denied to run, endpoints aren't damaged. All binaries are classified. We use cloud-based collective intelligence and a live repository of malware and goodware. Everything is run through our behavioral, static, and context cloud-based ML to determine all binaries in real time. Each of these binaries has about 10,000 attributes, and we do have 100% classification on everything that comes through our machine learning systems. We'll talk about how we do that as we step through the process here in a few minutes. But it really is important to understand that if we don't have this 100% classification, if we don't know absolutely everything that comes through, we can't protect those endpoints from being infected by malware. And this is really the critical key to the attestation service, right? It's part of the solution. We don't charge extra. There's no delegation. We've removed all these overwhelming alerts that you have traditionally gotten inside of the endpoint detection and response capability, because our classification service does such a deep inspection of all these binaries. So we talk a lot about machine learning. We talk a lot about artificial intelligence. Those are some hot keywords when you search for them. Our marketing teams love those. But we want to talk about what that actually means, right? Machine learning can mean anything. It can mean, artificial intelligence can also mean anything. I joke with my wife that she doesn't want anything to be automated or artificial intelligence in our house because she doesn't trust it. And I say, well, we can't buy a car that has automatic windshield wipers then, because the computer's making a decision for you. That joke never lands with her. So I don't know if it lands with anyone else. But the idea of what your machine learning AI is doing can mean anything. And so it's important that we talk about what that actually is for us. And for us, machine learning is a means to an end. We use these to do the classification of all of the processes that we see, all the binaries that we see. And you can truly do these things at scale. So when we look at our cloud-based machine learning, we call it the ranker. And we call it the ranker because it's a grouping of models. So each one is designed to predict a classification in each process with algorithms of different natures working with a set of flags. So for anyone who's worked with WatchGuard in the past and understands how our threat sync solution works, right? The final verdict is a weighting of the partial results. This was another thing we loved about Panda. They took a very similar approach to protection that WatchGuard already took. We look at a bunch of different indicators on a file or an executable. We give those indicators a score. And when all of those scores add up to a specific weight, you end up with something that we take action on. Panda does it in a very, very similar way. Right? The idea with what they've called in the past the ensemble model is that we maximize accuracy and confidence in the ML results, where they actually have a zero false positive rate, and this generates these deep classifications that we know we can trust, because it's not just one thing that said this is bad. We take about 10,000 different binaries, like we said, your 10,000 attributes, on every single binary. We pass these all through these different engines. The models use a broad set of algorithms, and again, so that we know we have some very simple similarity algorithms, decision trees, and then even neural networks and deep learning. So we do have a number of different machine learning algorithms that run against these, and then these thousands of flags are input by the model to generate behavioral and context executing classifications on all of these things. That gives us the right visibility, right? So we collect all this telemetry into a single kind of event storage, which creates this historic timeline of data. We have 30 different telemetry categories with about 94 subcategories, and again, those 10,000 attributes for each binary. Just from a statistics perspective on what the Panda Threat Labs actually looks at, we look at about 4,000 events per machine daily, with about 4 billion events processed daily by our big data engines. And in the last 12 months, Panda's collected about 500 billion events. We've classified 5.5 billion processes. There have been 2.3 million new undiscovered malwares and potentially unwanted programs that have been found. And 99.98% of this was accomplished through our machine learning systems. So we have analysts in a lab that touch anything we don't get, that last mile, right? Those things that we haven't seen, something the engine isn't sure about. We have a 0.02% of all this content that goes through our analysts and goes through our actual people in a lab. But 99.98% of this is able to be accomplished through the algorithms we have in place. And that's because on the right, we see the telemetry data that's collected. We see the different pieces of that telemetry data that we can look at. You've got vulnerable apps. You know, we can see what has been traditionally vulnerable, looking at the network data for things like files were downloaded, we had a network communication established, which seems strange for that file. Let's look at what it is. Critical actions like an agent install or an upgrade, those OS integrity pieces, understanding that the host files haven't been changed in your OS. And then even some other things like process manipulation and data access. What are these files doing? What are these processes doing? Are they doing remote execution? Are they looking at new processes or creating new processes? Are they looking at data on your machine? Are they trying to touch the cloud? All of these pieces of visibility are critical to getting to that 99.98% so that we can get you over the last mile with analysts. The goal here is that people are slower than machines, right? And so we want to make sure that we can make instant decisions using this telemetry data in the cloud for everyone. So how does it work? We've talked a little bit about the kind of the steps, right? We've talked about what the classification and the attestation service does for you. But if we look at how the attestation actually works, this is what I like to call a day in the life of a process, right? We use a sequence of technologies to do this 100% classification so that we can ensure that only the ones that are certified run on your endpoints. So if we start all the way to the left over here, we have local technologies like signatures, heuristic behavior analysis, anti-exploit, things that are running out on the endpoint. We have an agent on the endpoint. It's how we do everything. And there are capabilities inside of that agent that are critical to the first line of defense, right? These are those known threats. Everything is streamed up to this event storage in the cloud, which helps to feed into those engines and do that classification. And we also do a cloud-based lookup. So if we don't have an answer on those local technologies, we'll then go, okay, what does the cloud say? And we start with just the basic, hash inspection, right? Known malware, known goodware. Across these two, the known malware, known goodware, we have about 5.5 billion pieces of collective intelligence. And without even doing a lot of work, just a basic cloud lookup and some local technologies, we get to just over 73% of classification. So we start with, we don't know anything about your machine. We put an endpoint client on there. That client starts to churn with its local technologies. It calls to the cloud for anything we don't know about. And we can get your machine to about 73% classified without having to do really a lot of heavy lifting. From there, the event storage sends these different processes, executables, files, anything that we need to understand or don't understand from our known malware, known goodware lists up to our machine learning and classification engine. So anything that's unknown goes right into the Adaptive Defense cloud-based machine learning. This now churns on all the information that we see, right? All the different indicators, those 10,000 attributes that we talked about. And using those 10,000 attributes, we do get to that 99.98% of automatic classification. It's also critical to understand that we don't want to do this on every single thing, right? So all of that data that we now classify feeds back into our general collective intelligence so that those decisions will be faster every single time you need to make them. Every single new threat we see and classify, we pass right back into our collective intelligence and continue the loop. From there, anything that we still don't understand, new attack patterns, something that the engine hasn't seen, it doesn't understand, we do send to those malware analysts in our lab. And those analysts will do that final classification on it. They'll execute the files in sandboxes that they're running themselves, not in a cloud sandbox. And they'll really look at what this is doing, make a decision on it, classify it. And then we'll feed that back into our cloud-based machine learning. So you have this step all the way back to that local technology on your endpoint. We start with basic behavior, we go to cloud classification, we go to machine learning classification. If we still don't know a person touches it, and along each of these steps, we feed that back so that we can make sure that each time we see this threat, we're actually taking one fewer step and providing a faster, quicker, and better response to all of your endpoint needs. One of the things that I find so exciting about the attestation service and this classification is looking at the historical impact it had on the Panda malware labs. So even before the attestation service was running, Panda had a malware labs. Those malware labs and analysts would do support calls. They'd respond to threats. And this is a busy graph. So let me try and walk you through it here. In 2015, this dark blue line at the top, these are the number of malware incidents that Panda saw escalated to their labs every week. And we can see that these are very high, right? A quarter of the way through 2015, they had more than 60 escalated in a single week. So that was a busy week, but this trend was up at the top. Near the end of 2015, right about the middle of it, they launched the attestation service and they started using these machine learning tools to drive their intelligence. They weren't relying on it yet because they didn't have enough technology and enough built up into their engines to really make a decision there. But in 2016, we see that even with the limited data sets they had, we started to see those come down. Across the board, those started to come down. In 2017, we saw a drastic reduction because this is when they really started relying on that attestation service to make the decisions. So now, instead of these incidents being escalated because a customer saw them, these incidents were resolved before the customer ever saw them, because we were able to look at everything that was running out on Endpoint and say, listen, this is classified. We know it's good. We know it's bad. There's no decision to be made. We've got that done for you. And then in 2018, this very last line, right about 3/4 of the year, that dropped down to 0, and it hasn't really come back up. We don't see malware incidents escalated to Panda Labs in the same way that we used to. This is really about Panda Labs are now able to focus on supporting teams. They've switched from reactively responding to compromised customers to proactively notifying them about the detection of suspicious activity in their endpoints. This is really about these proactive approaches to protection. Endpoint detection and response, it has response in the name, but it does need to be proactive, and this is one of the things that attestation service gives you. A bunch of people love this. I know that Gartner specifically said it drastically reduces the threat surface of endpoints. There is a ton of other information about this. If you dig into the peer research and the peer insights groups online, people talk about this attestation service as how it has helped them, how it's changed their experience of endpoint protection. We're really excited about this. It is a very exciting piece of the puzzle to us. So the other thing, we talked a lot about the attestation service. We talked a lot about the value of that attestation service for protecting your endpoints. But as part of that, we have a managed threat hunting service as a feature. I know that's a mouthful, but the idea here, is that those threat hunting capabilities need to be built into our labs. Our analysts need to be looking not just what's in front of them or what we're seeing today, but going out and finding threats. And that is something that the Panda Labs has been very good at. It's something we're super excited about to expand at WatchGuard. We have our own analysts and our own threat lab that's been doing a lot of this. And when we bring these two labs together, we're very, very excited about what the outcome here will be, because the managed threat hunting service as a feature is really, it's not about threat hunting in a traditional enterprise sense of that word. This is something that has to go, you have to have in large environments. We have to be able to go out and find new things that we don't even know are there, these living off the land attacks, things that are hiding or invisible to a lot of these other solutions. And even this is key to the Panda solution, even to the base level Panda protections. We have to go out and classify everything that's on the endpoint. And to do that, we have to have a team of people that are hunting these threats. So we really do have the ability to do hacker detection. We can find attacks using these living off the land techniques. We can find attacks that are using lateral movements through your environment. We're able to identify malicious employees, right? User behavior modeling. How does a user normally behave? What is a user doing today? These are all things that are critical to understanding what could be happening in your environment, and not just responding to threats, but going out and proactively finding them. And then new threat detections in the endpoint, new or improved indicators of attack allow us to block those attacks before they can cause any damage. The threat hunting service really does monitor everything that's happening in endpoints in real time through our event telemetry store. And in case of access, the actions are recorded, and we can use that to do a backtrack for forensic analysis of any attacks we see, and then take action on those attacks. So by continuously monitoring our customers' endpoints and processing the flow of events in real time, with tools and technologies hosted in the Adaptive Defense platform, we're able to filter, classify, search for, and detect anomalies in the set of events. These anomalies don't correspond to typical patterns and dynamics of malware-based attacks, but really are anomalies in relation to two different groups. So we have, one is detection rules, right, for known attacks, for indicators of attack or indicators of compromise. These are triggered by the threat engine in the stream of events. We also have this other group of kind of the new hypotheses, right, regarding indicators of attacks that threat hunters are currently evaluating. We use these to verify or modify the real-time event streaming engine or retrospectively on previously processed events. So events that were stored global events that we save up for up to about 12 months, we can go back and back test against this using the hypothesis. Whenever an anomaly is detected, it's analyzed by an expert to confirm it. If it is an anomaly in a standard behavior profile, which is that first detection rules for known attacks, if it is an anomaly, and after the analysis, it is established that it's not an attack, the analyst modifies the baseline values to avoid a false positive. If it is a detection alert corresponding to a working hypothesis of the hunters, it's validated and confirmed by the analyst. The hypothesis becomes a new threat detection rule and is added to the list of known attack indicators. So when we look at this on the screen, we have our analysts over on the right. They do this generation. They look at indicators of attack or indicators of compromise. We say, this might be something we're not sure. So they go in, they use this hypothesis against our historic timeline in the event storage, and we use our real-time threat engine to look at indicators of attack or indicators of compromise. And then we do an investigation. We use these forensic tools to make a determination, and we pass that back into both the customer endpoint and the event stream so that anything that comes through in the same way or in the way that we've seen so far through this hypothesis is now protected, and your endpoint is now protected. We think this is really critical, particularly when we look at some of the things around the indication of malicious employees. And one of the things that I'm so excited about at WatchGuard is that we're looking at our user-based security in a new way. And when we talk about this endpoint security, it's great. You have to have endpoint security. You have to have this detection and response capability to make sure your endpoints are protected. But anytime we're talking about users, the first thing to me that we have to understand is who the user is. We have to actually look at that user and say, I do know that you are Ben Oster. I am 100% confident that you are Ben Oster. And if we know that that's the case, we can start to take different responses to them. If we're not sure, we have to look at the behavior that I'm modeling very, very differently. And what that has allowed us to do is layer in our other solutions for user protection. Our strong multi-factor authentication is critical in this identity model. It's critical to understand and trust that the people connected to your systems and the users on your endpoint are who they say they are. And strong multi-factor authentication with risk-based actions, with strong password protections are all key to that. And at WatchGuard, we have our AuthPoint solution that does strong multi-factor authentication that is foundational to this user-based security. And once you know who the person is, you're able to take a deeper look at what they're doing. And I find that layering these things in is so critical. And that's one of the things that I'm so excited about, again, like I said, at WatchGuard, is that when we look at our user security profile, we're not looking at endpoint security or authentication or just DNS protection. As a portfolio security company, we're looking at the authentication and who your users are and how they're authenticating you and where they are, and are we certain who they are, who they say they are? We're looking at their behavior on the endpoint. We're looking at the way they pass network traffic. And then because we have this portfolio level view of user activity, network activity, and endpoint activity, we can actually continue to expand this kind of big telemetry store to not just look at endpoints or not just look at authentications or not just look at network, but really correlate across all of those points of access. The points of presence for your users, how they access your data, where they come from, what they do, it is really central to the way users behave. It's central to the way we protect them. And I'm really excited to continue to bring that forward to everybody, to continue to layer security solutions in. I'm very, very passionate about user-based protections and the user being both your strongest benefit and your weakest link. We are nothing without our people, and they are also the #1 vector of attack. So let's make sure we know who they are, we know they're protected, and we do everything we can to support them while they're out there in the wild. So that's really it for me. I didn't want to just ramble on for an hour, but I wanted to make sure we had time for questions here. I want to talk about anything that you have questions from a WatchGuard perspective, from a Panda perspective, from an integration perspective. All of the Panda SKUs are available from Vertex right now. They can get you spun up with a trial. You can start playing with this. These are solutions that are available today for you to try out through Vertex, and we're really excited about it. So I don't know if there have been any questions so far, but I'm happy to take those as they come up.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate that. I don't see any questions here, but I just had one just to kind of clarify on your attestation services and the benefits to it as it comes in regards to machine learning. Appreciate you spending time to kind of demystify what machine learning actually is. But as far as your attestation service, just to be clear, the machine learning is a global machine learning template versus what I would say is a siloed or an organizational machine learning. Would that be a correct statement?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. We find that the threats that you may be seeing, or one customer or one user might be seeing, are generally the threats that are visible everywhere. And we also see these malware campaigns progress regionally, right? I remember, I think it was a couple of years ago now, but there were some specific ransomware campaigns that were running through, Eastern Europe, and then they slowly started to expand out. And one of the things that the global attestation service gives us, in this global telemetry store gives us, is the ability to see a threat in one region and protect in another before it ever even reaches that region. So we're able to take all the events from every single endpoint that is running and make decisions to protect everyone globally instead of just that one environment.
Yeah, that's a key difference. Whenever machine learning is a cover-all term now, just like Kleenex is anything you blow your name with, blow your nose with, or Xerox is anything you make a copy of. But with machine learning, there is two different types of machine learning. When someone says that there's security has a machine learning to it, especially when it comes to physical security, it's usually the physical security is localized, so it's only to your organization or to that location. Let me give you an example. I have a door lock that is on my house. It has a proximity to it. That way, if I get close to the door, it'll actually unlock the door for me. Whenever I first got it, if I turn the corner to my house, it would unlock. Well, my mother lives down the street, so I have to drive by my house to get to my mother's house. So it would unlock the door, and that was extremely aggravating. The machine learning now is to where I'm walking up the stairs, but that is an example of localized machine learning. What we're talking about here with this product is a globalized machine learning, to where somebody, maybe you see an attack that's specific to you, but that is then propagated to everybody else. And so whenever you first, because this is a mature product, as displayed by the graphs there, as this is a mature product, as soon as you install this, you have all the learning from all the other organizations prior to you available to you instantaneously. Is that correct?
That's correct, and I think that's a really good example of kind of that local versus a universal machine learning. The instance of you turning the corner is you're able to train that model to not unlock your house when you go to your mother's house. But it's also a really interesting example of how a company could use a local piece of machine learning and extrapolate larger data from that. So if you were to take that example and look at the way we look at the data, right, we would say, okay, you were driving past your house and it unlocked your door and you immediately said, no, lock my door again, right? We can look at that as a data point in a silo, right? We say, okay, we know he locked it, we need to improve his experience. So we can quickly solve that problem for you by saying, got it, you need to be closer, we've got that, no problem. But if you think about the hundreds or the thousands of people that are using that same door lock, if all of them are having a similar experience, and at 30 feet, they all lock it again. At 50 feet, they all lock it again. But we now know from the hundreds of thousands of pieces of data that we've received that maybe 7 feet away from the door lock is when we want to see this unlock. That's when most people are the happiest and never lock the door again when they approach it. So we can take what is a siloed event of you driving past your house, put it into a telemetry store, compare it to all of the thousands and hundreds of thousands of other data points we have, and now as an organization say, you know what, we're not going to unlock anyone's door at 30 feet. 7 feet is the new standard because we can extrapolate those siloed events into a universal approach. And it's a really, really good example of how you can take a local machine learning solution and put it into a larger piece of a puzzle and solve a much bigger problem and protect other people and make other people's quality of life better.
I appreciate that, Ben. Thank you very much. Well, since we don't have any additional questions here, I'd like to thank you, Ben, for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. And if there are any questions that come up, please reach out through John and Brittany. I'm happy to engage further if anything comes up.
All right. Thank you very much, and everyone have a wonderful rest of the day.